The ride back to their residence was noisy to say the least. Kesarah had a fit of near-incessant giggles throughout the trip, which was blessedly short. Ka watched as Kesarah rolled down the window on her side of the speeder and leaned out of it. Sitting upon the sill as she laughed wildly. "Kesarah," Ka called to her, "what are you doing?" Her response came in a fit of giggles as the speeder sat down and their driver hurried over to help Kesarah out of the window. As Ka came around the other side of the speeder, he watched as Kesarah ran up the path towards the estate, her heels clicking noisily on the duracrete. He sighed and jogged after her, wondering what she was going to do now. "Kesarah!" he called as he tried to catch up to her. "Wait!" Kesarah, though, didn't seem intent on listening as she looked over her shoulder and saw that he was gaining on her. She deviated from the path suddenly and jumped upon the rim of the fountain alongside the path, turning on Ka as he neared her and leaning forwards as she shouted. "Don't come any closer or I'll jump!" she shouted at him with a giddy smile. Ka stopped dead in his tracks, looking at her in disbelief as she giggled and began walking around the raised rim of the fountain, noticeably strutting. "You had a lot of fun tonight at my expense," she giggled with a slight slur. "I'm going to get you back for that." Looking at Kesarah as she walked around the fountain, Ka sighed and put his hands up questioningly. "How does this pay me back for anything?" Kesarah stopped mid-strut, slowly placing both feet firmly beneath her as she reached up to her neck and removed her cape, throwing it at him. Ka caught it and looked up in surprise as Kesarah's face broke out in a wide, drunken smile, and she toppled over backwards into the water with a splash. He stood there in disbelief for a moment before he scrambled up onto the fountain and looked into it, to see Kesarah floating in the water, laughing. He took a deep breath and climbed into the waist-deep water, wading to Kesarah's side and pulling her into his arms. She looped her arms around his neck, looking up at him with an obliviously happy smile. "Feel embarrassed yet?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, smiling awkwardly. "You're incorrigible," he stated. "And you're mean," she giggled, nuzzling against his chest and closing her eyes. "And I'm cold." "Let's get you inside," he said with a slight laugh as he wrapped her in his cape, "before you catch something." Ka focused his mind for a moment, and then his ears popped as the pressure changed suddenly and the world rushed around him like onrushing water. He and Kesarah dissolved and then reappeared inside of the reception room of Ka's chambers. He let Kesarah down as his body began to go into shock from the teleport. He wasn't used to doing more than himself, and as he slumped down on one of the long couches, panting and sweating, Kesarah looked around to the room. "This isn't my room," she declared giddily, turning to look at him. "Are you trying to seduce me?" Ka snorted, looking up at her with a tired smile. "Just trying to be helpful." She smiled at him, leaning down and putting a hand on his cheek. Ka's eyes widened as Kesarah kissed him full on the lips. He froze, unsure how to react to the sudden intimacy as she pulled away, her expression pursed and sultry. "Aren't you sweet?" she breathed huskily. His exhaustion forgotten as he looked up at her, she reached behind herself and began to fidget with her dress. "Kesarah!" he cried as he realized what she was doing, jumping to his feet. "Don't do that here!" His head spun as his body protested the sudden movement, forcing him to slump back down onto the couch as Kesarah grinned down at him. Her dress fell away from her body, leaving her standing before him wearing nothing but her underwear, heels, and gloves. "I'm in control now, little boy," she slurred as she planted her heel between his legs, leaning down and gazing into his dark blue eyes with their rich brown. Ka did his best not to stare at her chest as her bared breast bounced in front of him. Kesarah cupped his chin in her hand, tilting his face up to hers. "My eyes are up here," she murmured, as she leaned in against him and pressed her lips to his once more. This time Ka was more prepared, though no less shocked by the kiss, and returned it uncertainly. Kesarah's lips were warm and spiced, leaving a tingling sensation on Ka's lips as she pushed him down onto the couch, laying down against them as she tucked her head against his neck. They lay like that for several minutes before Ka realized that Kesarah was no longer moving and her breathing had steadied. "Kesarah?" he murmured. She didn't respond, laying immobile against him as her braintails trembled subtly. He tilted his head slightly and realized her eyes were closed. She'd fallen asleep. She'd fallen asleep on him, mostly naked, on a couch with her arms wrapped around him. He swallowed, unsure what to do as he tried moving, but earned a displeased moan from the sleeping Twi'lek. Gently he wrapped his arms around her, careful not to squeeze or pinch her braintails as he focused again. The sound of rushing water filled his ears once more as the room around them dissolved, and they reappeared in the bedroom. His body was on fire, now truly sweating. With Kesarah still atop him, Ka didn't have the strength to trust their position, as he passed out with his partner lying across his body. The light from the rising sun shining through the vast windows woke Kesarah as she groaned groggily. The first thing she was aware of was that she had a splitting headache. How much had she drank last night? The second thing she was aware of was that she was naked, or close to it. That wasn't so unusual in and of itself. What was unusual, at least in this case, was the third thing she was aware of. She was lying on top of Ka. For a brief panicked moment she thought that maybe she'd slept with him the night before, Then she realized that while all she was wearing were her gloves, shoes, and underwear, he was still fully clothed. That brought as much relief as it did anger. Why was she practically naked and he was still wearing his clothes? She didn't know what annoyed her more, the thought that he might have taken advantage of her, or that she had exposed herself this much and he apparently had not reciprocated. Looking down at his sleeping features, though, her ire softened. He looked exhausted. She closed her eyes, delving deep into her memories of the night before, to try and remember what had happened. It took some effort with the fog of her hangover obscuring her efforts, but she eventually found the memories she sought, and watched as Ka tried to keep her from making a fool of herself, only to collapse onto the couch. A gentle smile played across her features as she opened her eyes again and looked down at his sleeping face. He hadn't done anything really wrong, she decided. She'd behaved rather outrageously, and she wondered what he might think of her now. She was still annoyed with him for letting her be manipulated at the party last night. She would have her revenge in that regard, but the rest of the night she could forgive. She was even grateful that he had tried to be as kind about it as he had. Leaning down, she planted a soft kiss on his forehead and then slipped from the bed. Walking out of the bedroom and into the reception room, she found her discarded clothing and gave a self-incriminating smile as she refreshed the memories of just how wild she'd been the night before. Would she have minded sleeping with Ka? And by that she meant actually having sex with him, not just passing out on top of him. She wasn't sure, really. He was another Jedi, after all, but he at least hadn't been judgmental or affronted by her playful flirting. She began gathering her things from the floor when a knock came at the door. She looked down at her state of undress and felt her face flush as her leku twitched and spasmed. "Sir Knight," came the inquiring servant's voice. "Are you awake?" Kesarah looked towards Ka's bedroom for a moment before another knock drew her attention to the door. "Sir Knight, I'm coming in," the servant said. Unsure what else to do, Kesarah vanished from sight as she wrapped the light shining into the room around herself. She began dressing as quietly as she could as the servant entered Ka's chambers, walking through it to the bedroom where she found him asleep still on the bed. "Oh," the servant said as she realized that Ka was still slumbering. She bowed quietly, murmuring an apology as she backed out of the room. Kesarah stood by the door, now once more wearing her dress, just let the light assume its natural path again. "Oh," the servant said in surprise as she realized that Kesarah was standing in the doorway. "Good morning, noble Jedi." She bowed her head. "Were you not attended to in your room?" Kesarah shook her head. "No, that's not it at all. Would you have our breakfast brought here, please? We'll eat once Knight Han has woken up." "Of course, Lady Knight," the servant said with another bow. "I'll see to it at once." With the servant gone, Kesarah sat down on the couch where she and Ka had nearly misbehaved the previous night. She looked down at her dress and decided that she would change once she and Ka had eaten. She still had to go back to her room after all. Then something perked her interest as part of her memories of the night before stood out. What had exhausted Ka so much? And why didn't she remember going from the fountain to his chambers, or from the couch to the bed? She frowned, searching the memories ingrained within her brain-tales. Try as she might, she couldn't find an answer. She'd just been in one place and then the next. Had he carried her to the bed? That made sense. She'd been passed out by then, after all. However, that still left the gap from the fountain to the room, and why was he so exhausted in her memories? He wasn't out of shape. Far from it, she imagined, given the sparring matches she'd had with him on the Starliner. So why was he so tired? Returning to the memories of the fountain, she examined it again and again, seeing him holding her in his arms, and then everything just seemed to jump to his room. It didn't make sense. People didn't just transition from one place to another like that, except maybe in a dream. What had happened? Ka woke groggily, greeted by the glaring sunlight in his face and the smell of breakfast wafting through the bedroom. "Morning, sleepyhead." He rolled over and found Kesarah, clothed, sitting at the table by the window with breakfast laid out. He sat up on the bed, blinking through the light as he yawned. "Morning. How are you feeling?" Kesarah gave an elegant shrug. "Better. I was wondering if you were going to wake up." Ka responded cheaply. "Sorry. I was kind of worn out." "Yeah, about that," Kesarah said as she crossed her legs over one another, letting her dress fall away and exposing her red skin. "I have a question for you." Ka jerked his eyes up from her exposed leg with an effort. "A question? We didn't do anything serious." "I know," Kesarah said with a sultry smile, "and I want to apologize for that. We could have had some fun if I hadn't passed out on you." Ka's face turned bright red as he coughed and looked away from her, rubbing the back of his head. Kesarah laughed. "Oh, good. You still have some shame. That means I can still get back at you for what happened at the dance last night." Frowning, Ka got out of bed and joined her at the table. "What was your question?" Picking up her fork and poking at her food, Kesarah leaned forwards to look earnestly into Ka's features. "What did you do last night that wore you out so much? I was the one who acted like a fool and got drunk. So why were you so tired in all my memories after we got back here?" Ka hesitated a moment, his hand on the glass of juice by his plate. just something that happens, he replied. Uh-huh, but why does it happen? Kesarah pressed. Look, Kesarah, he began. She said, raising a finger and putting it against his lips. First off, it's Kessa. You saw me practically naked last night, and might as well continue that intimacy. She leaned back in her chair. Second off, I want an actual answer that isn't an evasion. Ka looked at her for a moment before nodding, pushing his chair back and standing up. I can teleport, he stated simply. Kesarah blinked. You can what? It's easier to show you, Ka said as he closed his eyes. He heard Kesarah gasp as his body dissolved and reformed back on the bed. Despite the effort it took, he did the trick a second time and rejoined her at the table, where he hurriedly sat down and began eating before his body failed him. Whoa, Kesarah said, gawking at him. That explains the fountain. Yeah, I didn't want to carry you the whole way back to your room, so I just teleported us here. It takes more out of me the further I have to go or the more people I have to move. So it's kind of useless as anything other than a stunt, Kesarah said with interest, her food seemingly forgotten. Ka swallowed his mouthful of food and nodded. I've been getting better at it since I was little. I used to only be able to go a few meters. Now I can go a few hundred meters. Impressive, Kesarah said. That's a trick I can't do. Ka shrugged. It takes a lot out of you. Neither of my parents can do it, so we're not sure where I inherited it from. Somewhere further back in the family, I guess. Kesarah smiled at him. Well, it's good to know. It might come in handy someday. Ka shared her smile for a moment before a knock at the door interrupted them. Excuse me, noble Jedi, a servant said, but Prince Emir Vranek would like to see Knight Dilicus. Oh? Kesarah asked with an edge to her voice. Would he now? The servant bowed, though whether in reaction to Kesarah's tone or just out of respect was hard to tell. Yes, he sent an air car for you and asked that you join him at his estate. Kesarah looked from the servant to Ka, who shrugged, his eyes watching her curiously. You two did hit it off nicely last night, he said finally. Kesarah's leg twitched as she scowled at him. Don't remind me, she stood up. I'll go change, and don't worry, I won't let him use me again. Ka smiled at her, oddly glad that she wasn't mad at him. I know you won't, Kessa.